So what we'll be doing in the first lecture is, of course, we'll be explaining some of the practicalities of the course, and what you can expect to be doing in the course, what you can expect from us. And then we'll talk about the networked organization. So the most important, well, to start with, sorry, I was distracted because I saw a message on the screen that my internet connection was unstable, but I think I'm still here. First I want to say, well, social media at work, it cannot be more relevant to teach this course now, because like in the past couple of months or so, we've all experienced the use of social media in a broad sense, video conferencing in the workplace. So suddenly the entire economy had to shift for a large part online, with all kinds of intended and unintended consequences and positive and negative consequences for work. And we will touch upon a number of these topics, for example, in our lecture on employee commitment, cyber load, how exactly working from home and working using communication technologies affects the way we work in organizations. And that's what this course is about. So we'll, this course will be mostly a theoretical course. So if you expect you to learn how to use Facebook in an organization or how to set up Skype for Business, that's not what we'll be doing here. Instead, what we'll be doing is thinking about what exactly is social media. So on a more theoretical level, but which also I think is very practical, to think about what exactly is social media. Okay, it's Facebook, it's maybe Skype for Business, but if you look and think a bit further, what are the characteristics of social media and how do they affect how people in organizations function? And how do organizations affect the use of social media? So you cannot just implement social media in any organization. You have to keep track of the type of organization. So for us as a university, which is like really, in which we are already really used to working from home and working with other people around the globe, shift towards using video conferencing is maybe a bit easier than for other organizations who are very used to have to be at a single location. So we focus also on the interplay between organizations and social media. And that's maybe the most important premise of this course, is that we are going to look at what exactly is social media and information technology in organizations, and how does it interact with people, with the organization, etc. And so, as you will see in this first lecture, after the practicalities, we will actually not talk about social media at all. So we will talk about more of a macro perspective on technology in society and technology in organizations. And in order to make you realize, hopefully, that social media is not suddenly here, but there's like been a gradual development because of changes in society and changes in technology. And then in a lecture on Thursday, we're going to talk about what social media actually is, and we're going to talk about the we call affordances or characteristics of social media. So that's why this first lecture is called the Networked Organization, because we're going to talk about the networked organization, networked society. But maybe first some practicalities. It's an outline, but let's start with the course information. So we always formulate learning objectives for courses, which you probably never read. But for us, it's very important to have a kind of a focus on what this course will be about. So as you can see, so we'll focus not only on social media, but in the first 2-3 lectures, we give a theoretical overview of the network society, network work. We give a definition of social media, which is theory-based. And we talk about the most important theories that explain how people communicate using communication technologies. After that, in the remaining 4 or 5 lectures, we will have a more practical approach, still theoretical of course, but a more practical approach, and we discuss social media on different topics. So each week we will have a different topic social media and knowledge management, social media and employee commitment, in which we discuss the interplay between social media and that specific. So of course it's all in the schedule, but it may be interesting and relevant to point out what we'll be doing. So every week we will have a hearing lecture on Monday, which is not compulsory, but we really like you to attend because we want to have the impression that we talk to real people. And it's also very useful to ask questions. So every Monday, we start at 11 o'clock every week. So we will have a hearing lecture. This Thursday we will have 2. We'll also have one at 1 o'clock on Thursday. But in most of the other Thursdays, we will have workgroup sessions in which we do something. So you will work on a group assignment, a theoretical paper, and we have 2 workgroup sessions in which we discuss that. We have a guest lecture, and in workgroup sessions, we will do practical assignments. Like, for example, in a couple of weeks, we have one on the pros and cons of using Zoom. So take care of the lecture schedule and see where or when all the lectures and workgroups are. I think most of you already signed up for a workgroup session. So if not, you have to sign up for a subgroup. And the subgroup you will sign up to determines a workgroup session. So if you sign up in groups 1 to 8, you have a session at 9, 9 to 16, you have a session at 11, etc. You have to enroll in a group by Thursday morning. And if you're not enrolled before that, you cannot take part in the course because a week after that, we already have the first group meeting. Workgroup sessions are compulsory. If you're absent without notice, we assume you quit the course and you remove it from Canvas. You have to attend the course, and you cannot switch workgroup sessions because in the workgroup, most of the time you will do something with your own subgroup. If you are late in signing up for a group, and if you cannot have the group of your choosing, then yeah, you will have to arrange something yourself because I cannot, kick someone out of the group to replace him or her with you. So you will have to arrange it yourself. Also very important, if you decide that Joost and I are very boring, or that this course is boring, or that you dislike us, or whatever, and if you decide not to take this course anymore, I would really appreciate it if you, I would first of all really appreciate it if you do take this course, but if you decide not, we would really appreciate it if you unenroll from Canvas so that we can allow students, other people to sign up for a workgroup of their choosing. So please enroll if you decide that you no longer want to take this course. Thanks. But of course, we all hope you do. So there are workgroup assignments in week 4, 6, and 7. There are assignments that depend on that week's theme. They're graded with pass and fail. And we give instructions on the workgroup sessions like a week before. Besides the hearing lectures and workgroups, you'll be working on a theoretical paper with your subgroup. It's a group-based assignment, therefore, and it's a theoretical analysis of an empirical paper on social media. The instructions will be posted on Canvas soon, but Thursday, Joost will give an explanation of what we expect for your group assignment, and he will explain the details of the empirical paper and the approach. So on Thursday, it will take in half an hour or so to take you through the group assignment. So don't worry about it yet. So course evaluation is a 60% written exam. The exam will be an open-ended question. Will be open-ended question and will be an open book exam. So because of Corona, we don't have a written exam like we normally do. And what we will most likely do is we will seek a time slot of, let's say, a day or so that you have a day to write short essays based on open questions. But during the lectures, once we have figured out what the exact date will be of the exam, we will provide more information about what you can expect on the exam. The research, not a research process, sorry, the group assignment is 40% of your grade, and you have to pass every part of the course in order to pass the courses. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And I saw that many of you, some of you already used the discussion forum. So feel free to ask anything about the course that you want. So that was the practicalities in a nutshell. How much time do you plan to allocate per group during group sessions? Yes, it depends. So in some work group sessions we have like a small assignment for each subgroup. So each subgroup, for example, has to present his or her ideas on that week's topic. And 2 times we have meetings with individual groups about the progress of your theoretical paper. So next week on Thursday we will have the first meeting in subgroups. In which we will discuss the plans for your group assignment. And then we will allot, I think, 20 minutes per subgroup. And then in those 20 minutes, we will discuss your ideas for your research paper. And then in week 5, we will give feedback on your draft for your group paper. And that's also 20 minutes. So Joost and I will both do, so in each work group session, there are 8 groups. Joost and I both do 4 groups. So we have 20 minutes per group, which is in total is 80 minutes. And then that gives us some leeway of about 50 minutes or so. Work group sessions will not be recorded because they are compulsory anyways. Lectures will be recorded and will be posted online on YouTube. So yes. But again, we'd really appreciate it if you attend the lectures if you can. Any other immediate questions about the practicality of the course? Nope? Okay. Cool. Then, finally that's over, then we can start with the actual lecture. So like I said, today we'll be not really talking about social media at all, but we'll be talking about the interplay between technology and society and between technology and organizations. And I think for a master course, which is called Social Media at Work, you will need that. So you'll need to think beyond technological capabilities and think about the broader societal impact and the societal and organizational process at work. And the interplay between society or people and organizations on the one hand and technology, specifically social media on the other hand, also technology in general, that's called social materiality. It's kind of a difficult word, social materiality, but it basically is just what I said. So it's the entanglement of the social and the material in everyday organizational life. So that's the official definition Wolitkowski, first paper, gives. But a simpler definition is just the interplay between technology, organizations, work, and people on the one hand, and between organizations, work, and people on the one hand, and technology on the other hand. And if you think about, just think about your mobile phone. It's here with me. Oh, other way around. In the lecture I now give, even when I'm giving the lecture, sometimes I look at the pop-ups of my mobile phone. So a technology such as a mobile phone has profoundly impacted the way we live. So it has impacted the way we make appointments and the way we communicate. But mobile phones have not just come up in a vacuum. Mobile phones answer to our own needs and desires. And the reason that a mobile phone now has a screen instead of only press buttons is that that's something that we wanted, and that has then been built into the technology. So it's an interplay between technology and us. So when you read literature on the use of technology in organizations, you often observe like two research streams. And you also see that when you talk with managers in organizations or when you work in organizations. So there's either one or two possibilities, usually. So either in organizations, the material, as you call it in social materiality, is not observed at all. So which basically means that once a technology is in place, we tend to forget it exists. So, but they still can have an effect. So for example, the effect of a seating arrangement has a huge effect on the way people can communicate. And I always give the example of, which well, now not a good example anymore, but I always give the example of when you enter a lecture room at the university for the first time. You don't realize it, but it's structured in a certain way. It's a large lecture room in university structured in such a way that that it's a kind of a podium. So you immediately know where you're supposed to sit. You immediately know that the person on the podium is the teacher, and that you're not supposed to say things, but that you're supposed to listen. So the material, the technology, in this case the lecture room, says a lot about how you will be able and how you feel you can interact in that lecture room. But we don't realize it because it's so commonplace. The technology or the material, in this case a lecture room, is so commonplace that we tend to forget that the effects of the technology exists. So that's one research stream. So once the technology is commonplace, we tend to forget the aspects of the technology. And the other research stream, and the other thing you commonly observe in organizations, is that when people realize there is a material component or there is a new social media tool that you can use, is that people see it as miracle cures or more official key enablers of change. Which basically means we have this new technology, we have iPhones, we have virtual reality, we have Zoom. This will change everything. So technology is observed, but the social aspect not. And well, if you look at hypes in communication technology, well, there are a lot of different examples, but what I remember from a long time ago, I think it's over 10 years ago, was that I was attending a meeting in which they explained some new kind of technologies, and they had the Microsoft Service Table. That's the image you see on the bottom, the table with the phones on. And then they introduced that new technology for organizations. Yeah, you can put your phone on it and your tablet, and then you can just swipe an image from your phone to your tablet, and then you can arrange pictures and etc. And I was in a room full with IT people who all thought that was a great and wonderful idea. And they said, wow, this is a great technology, will change the way we work, and you can stand around the table and have meetings, etc. And then I asked, when I was talking to a couple of those people, I asked them, okay, but how will people in organizations actually use it? How will this change meetings? You can do this, you can do that. I said, okay, but how? How will this change people's everyday work? What's the use? And those IT people, I can't blame them because they're focused on new technologies. But they were only thinking about the material aspects and not about that something like that has to be incorporated in an organization that already exists. And in general, people don't really want to change. And you have the same now with artificial intelligence. So AI will change everything, virtual reality will change everything, augmented reality will change everything. So we have all these new communication technologies that have huge potential, of course, but it's seen as a miracle cure for everything that an organization now encounters. And that's more of the technical idea of social materiality. And what social materiality argues is, okay, you have to see them intertwined. It sounds obvious, but it isn't always obvious in organizations, and it's not always obvious in practice. So basically what social materiality does, it integrates human and social-centric views and technocentric views of the use and effects of information technologies in organizations and in society as a whole. And this is what we call constitutive entanglement. I don't know why it's called constitutive entanglement. Well, I know why it's called entanglement, because it's intertwined. I don't know what the constitutive part is, but it's called that way. Which basically means that humans and technology are intrinsically linked and influence each other. And we can observe that at both a micro level. So if we specifically look at how we use social media, how we use our mobile phone, for example, and on a macro level, so on society and organizations as a whole. So basically, before we can even begin to talk about social media and characteristics of social media, we need to understand the interplay between technology, specifically communication technology, and society on a macro level. And we need to understand on a more micro level how people and technology interact. So that's what we'll be going to do today. We start with the macro level. Yeah, I have one to make it a bit more concrete. This is just one example of how you can study social media through a social material perspective. So if you think of professional social media use, I don't know if you already have a LinkedIn account, but this is the time that most of our master students graduate and are done with their thesis. And this is always the time that I receive a lot of LinkedIn invitations from my former master students and master course students, because they're building their own network. They're trying to, they're not really interested in me, but they're just trying to connect in as many people as they can in order to come across as someone who's well-known and professional. You have to build your identity online. So LinkedIn kind of allows us to build our personal professional identity. But it's not that happens in a vacuum. So it's not that LinkedIn invented technology and that we now build a professional identity. We've always had this like inherence in our in who we are as people, that we want to come across as positive as we can. So we want to present ourselves in a certain way. We've always done so. And LinkedIn just jumped on that bandwagon. And it allowed, so the LinkedIn technology is based upon our actual own needs and desires. But then again, the technology in itself allows us to do things we normally couldn't. And it also has brought self-presentation more into focus. So now it's more important to present yourself professionally than it was 20 years ago. So the arrows in this picture kind of indicate the whole links between the social part and the material part of LinkedIn and social media in general. So we build our professional identity. We can use LinkedIn for that. LinkedIn in turn sees that we use LinkedIn for certain practices. LinkedIn in turn adapts their software to accommodate what we want. We are in turn affected by the new possibilities of LinkedIn, etc. And that's social materiality in practice. So that's a more micro level, concrete example of social materiality, but you also observe this on a macro level. And that's what we'll be talking about next. So I want to talk about two things on this macro level. I want to talk about how work has changed throughout the ages, and that may seem to be a long way from social media, but it kind of helps to understand why we have social media in the first place. Because in 15, 20 minutes or so, you will see that social media is kind of a logical, it's kind of a step in a logical evolution that we have seen in society for maybe the last couple of 100 years even. But maybe in organizations specifically more in the last 40 years. We'll see that in a moment. So this is what happens when you Google work. So this is a Google image search of the word work. Is there anything that comes to mind? Is there anything that you notice in these pictures of work? Just type it in the chat. Yeah, stress. I can relate to the stress and despair, especially in the first weeks of a course. Not many happy people. It's kind of interesting that we associate with clock and time rush, and I haven't even noticed that there's stressed people. It's just for me, it's just normal that you look that way when you work. But you see a lot of technology. So you see clocks, you see laptops, you see a lot of technologies. I see a lot of paper, busy people, coffee, etc. Ambitious. And I know that we didn't have Google image search 100 years ago. But what would happen if I would have Googled work 100 years ago? What kind of images would I get then? Farmers, lots of paper, also people doing physical work, factories, no devices, no women working, absolutely, yeah. Men, yeah. They work as physical soldiers. Ah, yeah, World War I was over, no computers. So it's kind of interesting if you I think it took you. I think it took me to say from what does work would work have looked like 100 years ago for you to realize that what you see here on screen or here on screen is only one part of work. So it's what we consider work. And first of all, you have to realize that you're part of an elite group of people for who work is actually this on screen. For many people, work is still what you now type in, farming, factories, and other types of work. But it also shows that the whole nature of work has shifted a lot in 100 and maybe even in 30 years. And that shift from more manual work to what we now consider work, paper, technology, communication, that shift has been brought because of technology, but also because that's the way that society organized itself. So if you look at the way that work has changed throughout the ages, you see that again there's an interplay between technology and work. So yeah, let's do the 1980 or so. So if you look at, or oh no, maybe I don't know if some of you know the TV series Mad Men about an advertising agency in the 60s. Can you tell me how work then was different from now? And let's skip over the whole men, female, and harassment part. So if you look at the 60s, what would have work have like that looked like then, and how did it differ from now? So again, no computers, not much of multitasking that's still around. But how did we communicate then? How did we communicate in the 60s? Owl. Face-to-face, calling, fax. I'm not sure about fax machines when they became popular. Well, there was fax, of course, then. But, yeah, of course, letters, face-to-face. The world was smaller, business operated more local. Workspace and boundaries were made more defined. Typewriter, smoke signals. It's not that long ago. Yeah, but you see that on the other hand, you have other technologies. You have typewriters, letters. We had a thing that was face-to-face communication. So we used to, meet face-to-face before Corona. Um, but what you also say is that absolutely the world was way smaller. Business operated more local. Workspaces and boundaries were more defined than now. And absolutely work was more local than it is now. So now, Joost and I both live in Amsterdam and work in Tilburg. And it's not even that was a bit of an issue, but it's not that weird anymore that we live so far away from work and that we work from home a lot. So in the 80s, we wouldn't even have considered working in Tilburg and living in Amsterdam. So we had to move. But now it's become more normal. So organizations have become more global, less defined by space, by time, and by other boundaries. So organizations have changed a lot as well. So I'm coming back at the way office work has changed in a moment. But let's first go a bit more. So if indeed you imagine how people worked and communicated across the ages, we often talk about pre-modernity, which is really factory work, which is really farmers' work and people who often who worked in local small groups. So everything was organized locally. So you lived in your village, everything you needed was in that village, your future husband or wife was in that village. All the shops, not even shops, but all the farmers you got your produce from in that village, you worked in it, that was it. Since industrialization, the world has gotten bigger. So the technology that arrived then, the factories, allowed us to work in a different way. So it allows large-scale production, but it really changed how we worked and how we lived a lot. So we suddenly had to go to work. So before that, we didn't go to work. There was no distinction between work and at home because your work was always at home, a bit like now. But then in industrialization, there was a distinction between work and home. People had to go to work. And suddenly there were shops. You could buy stuff from shops that produced a specific product. So those technologies also changed society. So you no longer necessarily had to live in your village, but could live a bit further abroad. You didn't work at home, but you suddenly had a thing like colleagues. And a lot of other consequences. And then late modernity is a period that we call the information age. Suddenly information, well not suddenly, but information became a lot more important. So we see a shift from factory work to more information-based work. So suddenly we had things like insurance companies and universities in which a lot of people study, banks and information technology. So from the 1960s onwards, we see an increase in the service sector. And the service sector actually doesn't make stuff. So it makes information. And that also changed work. Suddenly we worked in an office, and suddenly there was a much higher need for communication, because in a factory, everyone is there, but in an office, everyone can be there, but work becomes more flexible. And information becomes more important. So suddenly the thing that you produce is information. So you have to get this information out to the new customer. So you have to communicate with other companies, with your customers, etc. So suddenly knowledge and information gets economic value. It's the thing you deal with. And now in the society we live in now, that has become much more profound. Not only because of the technologies we now have, but because of changes in society. And it's important to realize that the whole change in society, from farm-based to factory-based to service-based to information-based that we are in now, is not only a matter of technology, but it's also a matter of changes in broader society. So technology brings changes in the way we can function, but it's also a societal need and a societal change for us to want to be able to communicate with each other, which allows or which the technology then facilitates. And again, this may seem a bit off. This may seem a bit off from social media, but we're getting there. So if you consider this shift that we've seen in society during the last couple of 100 years, then there are a couple of trends that you can observe, and that's called modernity. So if you look at that, then the trend you can observe is that we see a reduction of space-time, which is kind of exponential. So again, a couple of 100 years ago, people were really based local. So we didn't really had a high need for communication. Everyone was in our village. Then through the ages, there was a reduction of space-time constraints. So suddenly, imagine a thing like the invention of the train or the bike. Suddenly we could go to another village within an hour or so. So it really changed the way we communicate and the way we lived a lot. And if you look at changes in society and changes in technology, then you see that it's characterized by, first of all, a reduction of space-time and space-time constraints. So on and on, we see that it becomes easier to communicate across vast distances, that we're not bound to time, we're not bound to being together at the same time. I get questions now, are these lectures being recorded? So if you cannot attend, you can attend them afterwards. If you have a question later, you can email. And again, this sounds really obvious for the society we live in now, but this is actually something that's not that new. Even in the 80s and 90s, this was not common that you could use video conferencing or use email in an organization. It's only in the last 20 years or so. So one change in society and one thing that has changed organizations is the reduction of space-time constraints. So we are able to communicate across vast distances, and we do so in modern day society. Well, the second thing is disembedding of social systems. If you look at how society has changed, then we see that we used to be able to do everything locally. We trusted people, so we trusted the mayor in our village, for example. But now we have all kinds of systems in place that we have to use separately. So we have money. So you didn't really have any need for money if you could just change a cow for some other food or whatever. But now we need to have all kinds of systems in place because we can communicate with other people. So we suddenly need to have we suddenly need to have money, we suddenly need to have insurance companies, we suddenly need to have a lot of laws and rules about how we can communicate with each other and how we can organize our society. And that's called disembedding of social systems, because because we used to have like everything we needed in one place, but we now need to go for everything we want to different places. Arguably, these 2 points are less relevant for social media. Increased reflexivity means that we increasingly, and change in communication that we have seen in communication technology increasingly allows us to think beyond our immediate surroundings, which has positive consequences. We have a plethora of access to information, so we can communicate with everything we want. We have Wikipedia and whatever we want to find information. And we used to think we have more. That would mean that the increased reflexivity would allow us to have reason over tradition and to would have more reliance on knowledge. And we do, but the unfortunate thing is that reason and knowledge is not always reasonable and knowledgeable. But it still means increased reflexivity still means that we are not bound to the people around us to inform us about anything we want, but we have the ability to communicate and to go wherever we want to find people with our shared interests and to find information that we need or we want. And finally, of course, we see that in a modern society, we have a kind of information technology revolution. So you see that if you look at the penetration of technology in over the ages, you see that, for example, if you look at the adoption of a phone, which I think this is the phone, the green one, that's been quite slow. But if you look at the adoption of smartphones and internet, that goes like really, really quickly. So we see that we increasingly rely on information technologies. I want to say something about the information technology revolution, and then we're finally going to talk about networks. But maybe we can have a short break now. So I don't think we need like a 15-minute break because there's no one to catch up with during the break. But let's say we have like a 5-minute break or so, and then we continue at like, let's say 5 before 12. So I can get a cup of coffee. Okay, so I'll see you in a bit. Okay, I'm back. Sorry I didn't saw the chat. I was giving myself a cup of coffee. The lectures indeed end at 12:30, so I won't be able to go through the entirety of what I wanted to discuss this lecture, but I will have some leeway next week and Thursday to discuss further. So we started 11 instead of 10:45 because I have a lecture right before, and moreover because we don't really need like a 15-minute break in between the lecture. So we end at 12:30 anyway, so no worries. Okay, let's continue. So it's a bit of a long route to get to get to one of the most important points of the lectures. But I hope you realize what we talked about in the before the break is that you see changes in society, you observe changes in society, you observe changes in technology, they kind of interact, and that's how we got into an information society. And if you look at what happened in the past 20 years or so, we really have seen an information technology revolution. So even if you compare our work today with our work 20 years ago, we rely a lot more on information technology than we used to do. And one of the most obvious ways that you can observe that is through the use of social media. So if you look at your mobile phone, social media, even since the advent of email, actually, how much work has changed and how much the way we work has changed in terms of working from home, in terms of different ways of meeting with people via mediated technology, working together on a paper, for example, via Google Docs, etc. So we've seen a kind of information technology revolution in the last 20 years, in which we increasingly see that machines really replace brain power. So machines and information technology used to be just kind of a repository, so a database or Word documents, etc. But now you see that machines are better and better able to get that information from us and present it in a way that we can understand. So TikTok automatically gives you suggestions based on the number of seconds you view a video. So if you, according to Realize, that if you scroll through TikTok and you hesitate for a second, TikTok immediately thinks, you must like that, and you get more suggestions for that kind of video. So machines increasingly take over our brain capacity. So they're not only a database anymore, they're also not only a communication device anymore, but you increasingly see that they take up more and more of the complex human tasks. So that's one trend we observe. The second one is like a pervasiveness of information technology. It's the ubiquitousness of social media, the ubiquitousness of having a communication technology at your side all day long. It's the first thing you get when you get out of bed. You check your mobile phone, your messages. It's the last thing you do when you go to sleep. It's putting away your mobile phone, and in between you use that a million times, not a million times, or like hundreds of times a day. These are, don't have time to show them now, but these are two videos that show the pervasiveness and or the negative effects of social media around society. But it's also pervasive in organizations. So many organizations, if not most, have a kind of internal Facebook with internal profiles. They have internal WhatsApp groups like Jive or Jabber. They have virtual meetings using what we do now, or Microsoft Teams or whatever. So it's become more and more commonplace to have IT in organizations. We also observe convergence of technology. So we observe that technologies go into one, that they become more of like one technology which can do anything. So like your mobile phone is not only to call, but your mobile phone can be used for a lot. So you can use it across time, across space for many different purposes. And it also sounds obvious, but there was a time that you need to have a television and a game computer and a computer and a phone and a lot of other separate technology. And finally, and maybe most importantly for the study of social media, is that we see that information technology has kind of allowed for a kind of network logic to understand, to come into existence. So we increasingly see that people, machines, and organizations are interconnected because we can, using information technology and social media. And what I mean concretely with that is simply your list of connections on LinkedIn, your feed on Instagram, whatever. So increasingly, what we do with information technology is allowed by making connections between people, between information, between people and informations, etc. So the whole idea that TikTok works, the whole idea of behind Google search is based on connections between information from different people. And also increasingly the way we work depends on the connections we have. And that's the second part. And that is called networked individualism. So actually all of this, all the changes we observed in society and technology have kind of culminated now in something we call networked individualism. And well, I'll come back to exactly what this means in 3 slides. But for now, networked individualism means that you as an individual are embedded in a network within an organization and across an organization and within society as a whole. And that's something that really social media has changed and will change a lot. And this is the paper by Barry Wellman, second paper for today. And he makes the connection between the changes in society, so between pre-modernity, modernity, and the information age, and networks. And he says, well, if you look at the way society functions, you see that most of the changes you observe in society is a change in the way that people have organized themselves into networks. And what also is important, that you can also use this change in network structure to study organizations. Because if you think of what organizations look like 40 years ago with what they look like now, you see that because of the change in IT and because of what we now call social media, an organization is more and more networked. So let me explain what it exactly means. And you observe this in society as a whole and in organization, but let's start, it's easier to think about society. So if you think how people in early industrial society lived, is that they lived in little boxes, like the image on the screen. So you see a few groups with clear boundaries. It was hierarchical and structured. It was bounded by place and time, and it was mostly face-to-face. So think of each box in this figure as a village or a family. So they mostly communicate with each other, and they have few outside connections. So here we have drawn in none, but of course there are always connections between villages, between families, between groups of people. But you can imagine that 100 years ago, people lived fairly in little boxes. So much of the contact within their own groups, kind of hierarchical. You would listen to the family elder or to the mayor or pastor in a village. All your social activity had to take place face to face at a certain time and place. And dominant communication is face to face. And then if you look at how organizations functioned even like 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, organizations were also little boxes. So before the whole information technology revolution, organizations were mostly based on a single location. So of course you had multinationals then even, but most of the work that people did was in little boxes. It was with their own colleagues, it was face to face, it was pretty hierarchical and structured. It was bounded therefore by time and place. So that was the dominant mode for organizations as well. Wellman says, if you look at what happens now, or what happened from the 1960s to the early 2000s, is something he called globalization. And that means that you increasingly get connections between those little boxes. So people can work, now if you look at society as a whole, it becomes increasingly easy for people to travel, to visit other places, for example, by the invention of the bike, the car, the train, etc. And also since we have a telephone and the internet, etc., you see that people can organize themselves into different networks. So first of all, those little boxes that we had are not necessarily bound by place and time, so they're not necessarily face-to-face and place-bound, but they can be based on psychological interest, so community based on interest, psychological neighborhoods. So therefore, social networks, the people you know, become disembedded from place and also a bit from time. So you can communicate with other people, not necessarily in your own organization, in your own apartment, or in your own the place you live in. But still, you see that it was not that easy. So you see that it's still pretty globalized. So the dominant mode of communication is fixed phone, mail, and fax, for example, but also still face-to-face. So people still organize themselves in little boxes, but with more and more connection. Also, people can organize themselves in more than one box at a time. So for example, I'm part of my department at Tilburg University, so that's a little box for me. I also have my family. I have some interest groups that I follow on Reddit, for example. Those are all kinds of little boxes with few connections between them. So this is called globalization, and this is actually where we are now. So face-to-face is still important. We still have our own little boxes, but we have more than one. There is increased connection within and between those boxes because it becomes increasingly easy to communicate with people inside and outside those boxes. But still, we're pretty much tied to those boxes. We're still pretty much tied to departments, to colleagues, to family, to interest groups, etc. And again, this may sound obvious, but it isn't. It's only because of the changes in technology and the accompanying changes in society that we got here, that we were able to do this. So that's the second one. And again, this is how we function most of the time. But Barry Wellman says, well, if you look at what happened in society during the last 20 years or so and what's still emerging, then you see that there are a couple of changes in society and organizations which are spurred by the revolutions in technology such as social media that has caused us to go to something that is called networked individualism. And Wellman argues, he says that, well, those little boxes that we belong to now become less and less important. He says we may end up in a society and also in an organization that is kind of individual again. Oh, again, this individual, so that we have a large network with a lot of people, but we each do our own separate thing. And this is what you can slowly observe in organizations. So if you think about the changes in organization we observed, so a lot more people becoming self-employed, flex workers, people working with people from other departments, from other organizations even, by the use of communication and information technologies, you kind of see that this happens. So you see that person-to-person connectivity becomes more important. That's why I get all the invitations for my students to connect on LinkedIn. That's why we want to have 700 plus contacts on Instagram, because it becomes more and more important to have connections to a lot of people. And again, you also see that in organizations. So people organize themselves more and more into flexible work groups. So I teach this course with Joost, and the other course I teach with another colleague. And it also works that way in organizations. So you're part of multiple projects at the same time with different people, and you use communication technologies to be able to communicate with each other. So you switch between networks and between groups, and you work rapidly. And you observe more and more often that each person operates his own network for collaboration, for support, to get more work, and to belong to other groups. So increasingly you see that, for example, people who are self-employed, for them, their network is very important. They're not part of a little box anymore. They're part of a huge network, and they get support. They are part of support groups. They're for their free time. They're part of Reddit communities, for example. And they rely on those network connections for their work and also for their social life. And you see that the way people work and relate to each other at work is increasingly tied on specialized roles. That means that you have a specialization. I'm an expert in social media at work, and people can hire me to teach courses or whatever based on that topic. So you increasingly specialize and work together with people with other specializations to work. And finally, this means that weak ties become increasingly important. So strong ties are people you know well, are your colleagues you work together with on a daily basis, are your friends, your family. Those are strong ties. Weak ties are all your acquaintances, the colleagues at work you don't see that often, acquaintances you have, friends that you go out with once in a while, whatever. And in a network society, they become increasingly important, but because those are the people that can introduce you to a whole different network. And in turn, that can give you more work, more projects, social relationships, etc. So that is called networked individualism. And I hope you've noticed that if you look at what social media is, and what social media has allowed us to do, it pretty clearly matches the change we observe from little boxes to globalization to network individualism. Because social media has allowed us in first place to organize ourselves into groups that are not placed time bound. We can search interest groups on the internet. We can form communities on Pinterest based on the recipes we like, whatever. And in organizations, we can work together with people regardless of place and time in different project groups. So social media, first of all, has allowed, or an information technology in general, has allowed the shift towards more localized networks. And you now see that social media kind of changes society in a more profound way because networks become increasingly important. And to give away something from Thursday's lectures, very good question. You see that if you look at any social media you have, it's about, they all have those network capabilities. Twitter, you have followers and followees on Twitter. Instagram, you have followers. If you're LinkedIn connections, you have the network that's behind your TikTok interaction, etc. The question here is, do you see this as a good or bad thing? I don't know. What do you think? Anyone who has an opinion? Is this good or bad? That also allows me to take a sip of my coffee. The relationship becomes shallow. It doesn't have to be good or bad. It depends on which aspect. Could be in the middle. It's all good points. Depends on the motive of this and whether the relationship formed has a good or bad influence on your life. It helps timeless, might hurt interpersonal relationships. Well done. I think it's good in a way that people can do more and experience more as well, but it's bad because we somehow tend to depend on others in everything we do. No better than value individualism or not. In week 3, we have a workgroup session on Zoom, and where we can discuss a bit more about whether you value individualism, whether Zoom is for you great or not so great. But of course, it depends, and the issue with, okay, what does it do for interpersonal relationships is actually pretty important. So, for example, in organizations, there is a lot of thought and a lot of research and a lot of thought in by managers as well. How do we keep those interpersonal relationships intact when we have to work together, not face-to-face? Yeah, we tend to lose face-to-face relationships because we focus more on other type of relationships. So actually thinking about employee satisfaction, employee commitment, and commitment to the organization, but also, social commitment to your colleagues is pretty important in organizations, because you need that for an organization to function. You need people to like each other and work with each other. You need people to be able to know who works in an organization, so you can ask them if they can help you out. So, but still, it kind of depends. On the one hand, if you have those networks available, then it's easy to find out who actually works in your organization. So it's easy to find people you can work together with. But maybe the social aspect, the social emotional bond, maybe that's a bit more difficult to reach. Reckon to Ryan, yeah. People still, you can see this in the Corona era, people still value face-to-face relations very much. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, also, I would, but it's also possible that people get a very intimate relationship not using face-to-face, think Tinder and online dating in general. So there are a lot of different aspects involved here. And next week on Monday, we will talk a bit about computer-mediated communication theories. And then I will ask you a few questions about the quality of relationships face-to-face versus computer-mediated, and whether they are similar or not. But that's a discussion that will take me at least an hour or so. So let's do that next week. But the whole network thing can have positive and negative consequences, and it's pretty difficult to manage because it's still kind of new and we don't really know what all the consequences are. Yeah, so when we have face-to-face, it was taken for granted. Absolutely. But sorry, okay, I'm going to continue the lecture, else I won't be able to make the final points I want to make in time. So the whole shift to networks can have positive consequences. So because we can keep a list of connections, we can easily find out we know For organizations, it's also worthwhile because it allows organizations to be way more flexible in who works with whom on which project. But it can also have negative consequences for commitment, employee bonding, and also for personal relationships. Absolutely. Okay. So if you look at networked individualism, and if you then look at work, and you see that we've kind of changed from a situation in which you have the left side, so clearly defined groups, communication is usually within group, you are loyal to your organization, basically location based, etc. You see that the whole change towards more network based way of working makes switchboard individuals so that you can switch from person to person in your network connections. Your contacts are dispersed. You're more loyal to your own career than to your organization. You can work from home everywhere. You can also important that the groups you belong to may become more fluid. So you have more social identity. So more on that in a couple of lectures. So you see that this kind of profoundly changes the way you function in an organization and the way that organizations need to organize themselves. And this all is really tying very much to social media. That's basically what this course is about. It's about, okay, we observe that you are visible, you have connections in social media. What are the consequences? And at least to me, that's very, very useful to study because that allows you to think about the consequences of social media. And because that allows you to, to make predictions, to not only say, we have to use Snapchat in our organization, but you can think about why. Because, for example, because Snapchat is more fluid, because something can be gone after you say it, because it becomes easier to communicate with something. So if you look at social media from a perspective of, okay, what are the characteristics of social media? It allows more to organize yourself more in networks. And then if you look at the perspective from the organizations, okay, is network organizing something we want? And how can we organize that well? Then you can make predictions about how you can use social media in an organization. Then you can say, okay, we want a network-based application, so we want some other social media implications, but we need to have these rules in order to make it work. So, okay, that's a good point. Thanks, but it was probably not related to what I said. So basically, that's kind of the overarching societal and technological changes that we observe. So this again is social materiality. So you see that society changes in certain ways, which is given in by changing technology. But changing technology changes society, and that in turn again changes society and the way we work, etc. So that is more of a macro perspective on the interplay between communication technology and society and organizations. But you can also look at it from a more micro level perspective. So for how people in their daily lives use and are affected by technology. And that's what we call structuration of technology, or duality of technology. And again, this is social materiality. So this means that technology has features, or technology has certain characteristics that affect how we work, but it's also that the way we work and our own needs affect technology. And if you look at all the theories, so these, you don't have to remember this, of course, all these different theories, but if you look at all the theories we have about social media and communication technology in general, you see that some theories are really constructivistic, and that means they're material, they're based on people and society. And they argue for, well, technology is basically neutral, it's only if we study people and if we study how people use technology that we can make sense of technology. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have theories that say, well, no, technology has certain fixed effects on people. If you have a certain technology, there are just a few things you can do with it, and that affects people in profound ways. And again, the truth is somewhere in between, and you have all kinds of theories that go from a more technologically deterministic idea to a more constructivistic, people-oriented idea. And if you think about social media in the workplace, oftentimes in practice, when you read news about social media applications, when you work in an organization that wants to implement social media, it's usually from a very deterministic viewpoint. So people almost all the time say, well, we need this piece of technology, where we need to have corporate social media because it will change the way that people work. It's almost always a deterministic view. So there's an interplay between technology and surroundings. This is quite difficult, so I'm going to keep this for Thursday. I want to give an example of, where was it? Here. No, let's do the timesheet. I want to give an example of timesheets. It's not social media, but I think it's a good example to end the lecture. So if you think about constructivism versus determinism, and if you think about determinism, I don't know if you have ever worked in an organization where you have to keep time, but usually they have certain applications which force you to keep track of time and explicate what you did in a certain workday. And I worked at a research agency once, and every Friday afternoon, we had to fill in our timesheet. So I had to fill in, so Monday morning from 9 to 1, I worked on this project, so I had to fill in 9 to 1 project number, whatever. And that's a pretty deterministic technology. So there are very few ways to get around it. So you had to fill it in by Friday, because else if you would come back to work on Monday morning, you couldn't get into your system. So you first had to fill in a timesheet. And it's logical because they use the timesheet to bill external clients. So I had to say, when I worked on this project for this client for 4 hours this week, so they could bill the client for those hours. So it's a very good point. So you'd say that's a pretty deterministic technology, timesheet. But if you look at how a timesheet functions in practice, it's very, very different. So imagine it's Friday afternoon, it's 5:30, all your colleagues are already done. The thing you want to do is just get out of office, have a beer or 2 or 3 or more. But you have to fill in the timesheet. And you have kept track somewhat, but you have an agenda which is kind of chaotic. So what you do with the timesheet, and how everyone fills in timesheets, is, okay, you think, well, maybe this week, I think I worked for 2 days on this project. And what looks good, I'll just do that. I just pretend that I worked Tuesday the whole day and Wednesday and Thursday morning. So 16 hours. And you check from, okay, this client has a lot of money, so I just bill him for a bit more. And I bill him for the hour that I talked about football at the coffee machine. So that's the way that we fill in timesheets. So actually, it looks like a very deterministic technology, so we cannot really mess up timesheets. But if you think about the way that people use timesheets, it's way more flexible than you imagine. And that's really an example of determinism versus constructivism, versus the technology that forces you versus the freedom you have in using a technology. And if you then think, to end the lecture, think about social media, then you'll see that social media is pretty flexible in the options that it offers. I'm going to quit now. Next Thursday, Joost will talk about the group assignment, and I will take it up from here and explain a bit about 2 theories of determinism versus constructivism, which ends in a discussion about social media. So that's Thursday's lecture. And then, And then I'll see you on Thursday. So for now, thank you very much. And don't forget to sign up for a workgroup session, or if you choose not to choose the course, to unenroll for the course. And thanks, and I'll see you, or at least see your names on screen on Thursday. Thanks very much. And the question is, for the people who are still here, the recordings will be available the entire block, so we'll just put them on YouTube, so not for 2 weeks. So, see you on Thursday. Oh, question about the articles. We have to read like a preparation for the lectures? They are exam materials, but you know, it's an open book exam, but they are exam materials. If you have other questions, feel free to put it in a discussion group. Bye.